from homeless artist to history's greatest monster. Before we begin this journey together, if you find value in these deep investigations into the darker corners of history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, settle in. What you're about to hear is not a simple biography. It is an attempt to understand how one man, born into obscurity in a small Austrian border town, rose to command the most destructive war machine in human history and orchestrate the systematic murder of millions of innocent people. This is not a story for the faint of heart, but it is a story that must be told, because to forget, it is to risk repeating it. The question that haunts historians, psychologists, and ordinary people alike is deceptively simple. How? How did Adolf Hitler happen? How did a failed artist, a homeless drifter, a man rejected by the very society he would later claim to lead, become the absolute ruler of Germany and the architect of the Holocaust? There are no easy answers, but there are answers, buried in the details of a life that began unremarkably and ended in a bunker beneath the burning ruins of Berlin. Let us go back to the beginning. On April 20th, 1889, in a modest inn called the Gasthof zum Pommer, in the small Austrian border town of Braunau am Inn, a child was born. His mother, Clara Hitler, was a devout Catholic woman of peasant stock, gentle and submissive by all accounts. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, a stern and often brutal man who had clawed his way up from illegitimacy and poverty through sheer determination and an iron will. The child was their fourth, but the first three had died in infancy. They named him Adolf. The household into which Adolf Hitler was born was not a happy one. Alois was a domineering figure, quick to anger, quick to use his fists and his belt. He had been married twice before, and his current marriage to Clara, who was 23 years his junior and technically his niece, raised eyebrows even in the relatively relaxed moral climate of rural Austria. Alois was obsessed with respectability, with proving that he had risen above his shameful origins. He demanded absolute obedience from his children and tolerated no dissent. Young Adolf was caught between two worlds within his own home. His mother adored him, perhaps too much, smothering him with affection and indulgence after the trauma of losing 3 children before him. His father viewed him with a mixture of disappointment and contempt, seeing in the dreamy, artistic boy none of the practical ambition that had driven his own rise. The tension between them was constant and often violent. In later years, Hitler would speak of his father with barely concealed hatred, while his mother he would remember as a saint, the only person who had ever truly loved him. The family moved frequently during Adolf's childhood, following Alois's postings as a customs official. They lived in Passau, in Linz, in various small towns along the Austrian-German border. This rootlessness may have contributed to the young Hitler's sense of not belonging, of being an outsider looking in. He was not a popular child. He was sullen, prone to fits of rage, and utterly convinced of his own superiority even when all evidence suggested otherwise. In school, Adolf showed early promise but quickly lost interest. He was bright enough when he chose to apply himself, but he rarely chose to do so. He preferred to read, to draw, to lose himself in fantasies of greatness. His grades declined steadily, and his teachers remembered him as arrogant, lazy, and difficult. One teacher, Dr. Eduard Humer, later recalled that Hitler was notoriously cantankerous, willful, arrogant, and bad-tempered, and he was unable to pass his examinations. The death of Alois Hitler in January 1903 might have been expected to liberate the 14-year-old Adolf from the oppressive weight of paternal authority. Instead, It seems to have removed the last restraint on his already inflated ego. With his father gone and his mother too gentle to impose discipline, Adolf was free to indulge his fantasies of becoming a great artist. He dropped out of school at 16, having failed to obtain his leaving certificate, and spent the next 2 years in Linz doing essentially nothing. He slept late, wandered the streets, attended the opera, and drew. He had convinced himself that he was destined for greatness, and the mundane requirements of education and employment were beneath him. His mother, Clara, indulged him in this delusion. She gave him money, paid for his room and board, and asked nothing in return except his presence. She was dying, slowly, of breast cancer, though Adolf either did not know or did not want to know. When she finally succumbed in December 1907, Hitler was devastated. He had already suffered one crushing blow that year. In October, he had traveled to Vienna to take the entrance examination for the Academy of Fine Arts. He had been rejected. The Academy's assessment was blunt. His test drawings were inadequate. He lacked talent. The double blow of his mother's death and his rejection by the Academy seems to have shattered something in the young Hitler. He could not accept that his failure was his own fault. It must be someone else's. The professors who had rejected him were fools, or they were part of some conspiracy against him. The world was unfair, rigged against true talent. This pattern of thinking, the inability to accept responsibility for his own failures, the compulsion to blame others, would define Hitler for the rest of his life. In the spring of 1908, Adolf Hitler moved to Vienna. He was 19 years old, orphaned, rejected, and utterly alone. He had a small inheritance from his parents, enough to live on for a while if he was careful. He was not careful. He rented a room in a respectable district, attended the opera regularly, and continued to draw and paint, convinced that his talent would eventually be recognized. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts again in 1908. He was rejected again, this time without even being allowed to take the entrance examination. His drawings, the Academy informed him, were so poor that there was no point in testing him further. This second rejection was perhaps the decisive moment in Hitler's transformation. He had staked everything on his identity as an artist, and that identity had been brutally denied. He could have accepted the Academy's suggestion that he pursue architecture instead, but that would have required returning to school, obtaining the credentials he had never bothered to earn. He could have found a job, learned a trade, built a normal life. Instead, he chose to do nothing. He sank into a sullen depression, withdrew from even the few acquaintances he had made, and spent his days wandering the streets of Vienna, nursing his grievances. By 1909, his money had run out. He was forced to leave his lodgings and found himself homeless, sleeping on park benches and in doorways, lining up at soup kitchens for his only meals. For a young man who had always believed himself destined for greatness, this humiliation must have been almost unbearable. And it was during these homeless years, these years of degradation and despair, that Hitler's worldview began to crystallize into the poisonous ideology that would later consume the world. Vienna at the turn of the century was a cauldron of competing nationalisms, ethnic tensions, and radical ideologies. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was in its final decades, a patchwork of nations held together by little more than inertia and the aging figure of Emperor Franz Joseph. Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Croats, and dozens of other groups jostled for power and position. Anti-Semitism was rampant and respectable. The mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, had been elected on an explicitly anti-Jewish platform and made Jew-baiting a cornerstone of his populist appeal. Hitler absorbed all of this like a sponge. He read voraciously, though without discipline or critical thinking. He devoured the racist pamphlets that circulated freely in Vienna, pseudo-scientific tracts, that claimed to prove the superiority of the Aryan race and the degeneracy of the Jews. He attended political meetings and debates, observing how speakers could sway crowds through passion and rhetoric rather than reason. He became obsessed with Richard Wagner, not just for his music, but for his ideology, his glorification of Germanic mythology, and his virulent anti-Semitism. It was in Vienna that Hitler claims to have become an anti-Semite. In his memoir, Mein Kampf, he describes encountering an Orthodox Jew on the streets of Vienna, with his black caftan and black sidelocks, and asking himself whether this was a German. The answer, he concluded, was no. The Jew was foreign, alien, a parasite on the German body politic. This conversion narrative may be somewhat exaggerated. There is evidence that Hitler's anti-Semitism developed gradually, rather than in a single moment of revelation. But there is no doubt that by the time he left Vienna in 1913, his hatred of Jews was fixed and absolute. During his homeless years, Hitler eventually found his way to a men's hostel, a step up from the streets. There, he began to earn a meager living painting postcards and small watercolors of Viennese landmarks, which he sold to tourists and frame shops. He was not a bad painter in a technical sense. His architectural drawings show some skill. But his work was lifeless, devoid of human figures, emotionally flat. It was commercial hackwork, not art, and Hitler knew it, which only deepened his resentment. The men's hostel where Hitler lived was a polyglot community of drifters, dreamers, and failures like himself. Jews, Czechs, Hungarians, and Germans rubbed shoulders in the common rooms. Hitler held court among them, lecturing endlessly on politics, on the corruption of the Habsburg monarchy, on the Jewish conspiracy that he believed was responsible for all the world's ills. Some found him compelling. Others thought him a bore or a lunatic. None could have imagined that this shabby, wild-eyed young man would one day command the fate of nations. In May 1913, Hitler left Vienna for Munich. He later claimed that he could no longer bear to live in the racially mixed cesspool of the Habsburg capital, that he yearned to be in a truly German city. The more prosaic reason was that he was trying to evade conscription into the Austrian army. He had no desire to serve in an army that included Slavs and Jews as his comrades. He would rather risk arrest as a draft dodger than fight alongside those he considered subhuman. The irony, of course, is that within a year, he would eagerly volunteer to serve in another army, one that was about to plunge Europe into the most devastating war it had ever seen. When war broke out in August 1914, Adolf Hitler was 25 years old. He had accomplished nothing. He had no career, no family, no friends, no prospects. He was a failure by any conventional measure. But when he heard the news that Germany and Austria-Hungary had declared war on Russia and France, something changed. There is a famous photograph taken in the Odeonsplatz in Munich on August 2nd, 1914, showing a massive crowd celebrating the declaration of war. In that crowd, face alight with ecstasy, is Adolf Hitler. For him, the war was not a tragedy, it was a deliverance. Within days, Hitler had petitioned King Ludwig III of Bavaria for permission to serve in a Bavarian regiment, despite being an Austrian citizen. His request was granted, probably through bureaucratic oversight rather than deliberate decision. On August 16th, he enlisted in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, known as the List Regiment after its first commander. He had finally found a purpose, a community, a reason to exist. The army would be his family, his home, his meaning. The List Regiment was thrown into combat almost immediately at the First Battle of Ypres in October 1914. It was a slaughter. The regiment suffered massive casualties as it was hurled against entrenched British positions. Hitler survived, one of the few from his original company. He served as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between the regimental command post and the front lines. It was dangerous work. Runners had to cross open ground under fire, navigate through shelling and gas attacks, deliver their messages and return. Many did not come back. Hitler always came back. Over the next 4 years, Hitler served with distinction. He was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914, and in August 1918, he received the Iron Cross First Class, an unusual honor for a mere corporal. The recommendation was written by a Jewish officer, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann, a fact that Hitler would later try to suppress. He was wounded twice, gassed near the end of the war, and spent time in military hospitals. He never rose above the rank of corporal, apparently because his superiors considered him too odd, too lacking in leadership qualities, to be trusted with command. The war transformed Hitler in ways that are difficult to fully understand. For the first time in his life, he belonged. He had comrades who depended on him. He had a clear mission, an enemy to fight, a cause to serve. The chaos and danger of the front lines suited his temperament. He was brave, perhaps recklessly so. He seemed indifferent to death, as if he believed himself protected by some higher power or destiny. His fellow soldiers found him strange, unsociable, and fanatically patriotic, but they respected his courage and his devotion to duty. When Germany surrendered on November 11, 1918, Hitler was in a military hospital in Pasewalk, recovering from a British gas attack that had temporarily blinded him. He received the news of the armistice and the Kaiser's abdication in that hospital bed. According to his own account in Mein Kampf, he turned his face to the wall and wept. "Everything I had fought for," he wrote, "everything we had endured, had been in vain. The fatherland had been betrayed." This sense of betrayal would become central to Hitler's worldview and to his political appeal. Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, he and many others believed. It had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home, by communists, by war profiteers, by Jews. This stab in the back myth, as historians would later call it, was false. Germany had been defeated militarily, its armies exhausted, its economy collapsing, its people starving. But the myth was politically powerful. It offered an explanation for national humiliation that did not require Germans to accept responsibility for their own failures. And Hitler would ride that myth to power. In the chaos of post-war Germany, Hitler drifted. The war had given him purpose, and now that purpose was gone. He remained in the army as long as he could, working as a propaganda agent for the Reichswehr, the new German military. His job was to monitor extremist political groups in Munich and to give lectures to soldiers on the dangers of Bolshevism and the need for national renewal. It was in this capacity, in September 1919, that he attended a meeting of a tiny political group called the German Workers' Party. The German Workers' Party was one of dozens of nationalist, anti-Semitic groups that had sprung up in Munich in the aftermath of the war. It had perhaps 50 members, met in beer halls, and had no real program beyond vague resentments. Hitler was sent to observe and report. Instead, he joined. He had found, in this obscure gathering of cranks and malcontents, the vehicle for his ambitions. What Hitler brought to the German Workers' Party was something it had lacked: a voice. He discovered, almost by accident, that he had a gift for public speaking. In the beer halls and meeting rooms of Munich, he learned to work a crowd, to sense their moods, to tell them what they wanted to hear, to channel their anger and fear and humiliation into a weapon. His speeches were performances, carefully rehearsed, but delivered with apparent spontaneity. He would start slowly, almost mumbling, then build gradually to a crescendo of rage and passion. Audiences who came skeptical left mesmerized. By 1920, Hitler had effectively taken over the party. He redesigned its symbol, choosing the swastika, an ancient sun symbol that various racist groups had adopted. He renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. He created the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or Storm Detachment, a paramilitary force of brown-shirted thugs who protected Nazi meetings and broke up those of their opponents. He developed the basic themes that would define Nazi ideology: the supremacy of the Aryan race, the Jewish world conspiracy, the need for living space in the East, the rejection of the Versailles Treaty, and the restoration of German greatness. The message resonated. Germany in the early 1920s was in turmoil. The Weimar Republic, established after the Kaiser's abdication, was weak and unpopular. Hyperinflation had destroyed the savings of the middle class. Political violence was endemic. Communists and nationalists battled in the streets. French troops occupied the Ruhr industrial region. National humiliation was constant and inescapable. Into this chaos, Hitler offered simple answers. Germany was great. Germany had been betrayed. Germany would rise again. And those responsible for the betrayal, the Jews and the communists, and the craven politicians of Weimar, would pay. By 1923, Hitler felt strong enough to seize power directly. On November 8th, he and his followers burst into a beer hall in Munich, where Bavarian government officials were meeting. At gunpoint, he declared a national revolution and announced that he would march on Berlin to overthrow the Weimar government, just as Mussolini had marched on Rome to seize power in Italy a year earlier. It was a spectacular miscalculation. The Bavarian officials he had coerced immediately renounced their forced pledges once free. The German army and police did not rally to his cause. When Hitler and his followers marched through Munich the next day, they were met by police gunfire. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler fled, was captured, and was put on trial for high treason. The beer hall putsch, as it came to be known, should have ended Hitler's political career. He had attempted a coup and failed. He had been humiliated. But the trial became a platform for him to spread his message to a national audience. The judges, sympathetic to nationalist causes, allowed him to speechify for hours. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 9 months in relative comfort at Landsberg Fortress. It was there that he dictated the first volume of his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Mein Kampf is not a good book. It is rambling, repetitive, poorly organized, and often barely coherent. Its prose is turgid, its arguments circular, its evidence non-existent. And yet it is one of the most consequential books ever written, because in its pages, Hitler laid out with remarkable clarity exactly what he intended to do. He told the world his plans. The world chose not to listen. The book is part autobiography, part political manifesto, part racial theory. In it, Hitler describes his early life, his years in Vienna, his service in the war, and his entry into politics. He sets out his core beliefs: that history is a struggle between races, that the Aryan race is superior to all others, that the greatest threat to Aryan purity is the Jew, and that Germany must expand eastward to obtain the living space it needs to flourish. He discusses propaganda techniques, political organization, and the importance of willpower in overcoming obstacles. The anti-Semitism in Mein Kampf is not incidental. It is central. Jews are mentioned on virtually every page, blamed for virtually every problem. They are depicted as subhuman parasites, as the eternal enemy of the Aryan race, as the puppet masters behind both capitalism and communism. Hitler does not merely dislike Jews. He views them as an existential threat that must be eliminated. The nature of the Jew, he writes, is fundamentally destructive. The Jew is not a creative force, but a destructive one. He is a maggot in a rotting body. When Hitler writes about what should be done about the Jewish threat, he is chillingly explicit. If at the beginning of the war and during the war, he writes, 12 or 15,000 of these Hebrew corrupters of the people had been held under poison gas, as happened to hundreds of thousands of our very best German workers in the field, the sacrifice of millions at the front would not have been in vain. This was published in 1925. The Holocaust was still 20 years away, but the blueprint was already there, in black and white, for anyone willing to read it. Mein Kampf was not an immediate bestseller. Initial sales were modest, and critics dismissed it as the ravings of a failed putschist. But as the Nazi Party grew, so did sales of the book. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, it had sold over 200,000 copies. After that, it became virtually mandatory reading for German citizens. By the end of the war, more than 12 million copies had been printed. Hitler became wealthy from the royalties, though he always claimed to be a simple man of the people. The tragedy of Mein Kampf is that it was taken seriously by its supporters and dismissed by its opponents. Those who hated Jews read it and found confirmation of their beliefs. Those who opposed Hitler read it, if they read it at all, and concluded that its extremism would never be implemented. Surely, they told themselves, this is just rhetoric. No one could really mean such things. They were wrong. Hitler meant every word. After his release from Landsberg in December 1924, Hitler faced a changed political landscape. The immediate post-war crisis had passed. The economy had stabilized. The French had withdrawn from the Ruhr. The Weimar Republic, for all its flaws, seemed to be finding its footing. Extremist movements, both left and right, were losing support. The Nazi Party, which had been banned during Hitler's imprisonment, was in disarray. Many observers assumed that Hitler's moment had passed. They underestimated him. Hitler spent the next 4 years rebuilding the party from the ground up. He established a national organization with local chapters throughout Germany. He created new affiliated groups for women, for youth, for professionals. He refined his propaganda techniques and his speaking style. He cultivated relationships with industrialists and aristocrats who might provide funding and respectability. And he waited, patiently, for another crisis that would create an opening. That crisis came in October 1929, when the American stock market crashed. The Great Depression that followed hit Germany harder than almost any other country. American loans that had propped up the German economy were called in. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. Nearly a third of the German workforce was jobless. Hunger and desperation returned to a people who had thought themselves beyond such suffering. The Depression was Hitler's opportunity. He offered the unemployed the promise of jobs. He offered the frightened middle class protection from communism. He offered the humiliated nation a restoration of its greatness. He offered everyone a scapegoat for their suffering. The Jews, the foreigners, the traitors of Weimar. His message, honed over a decade of speaking in beer halls and meeting rooms, was perfectly calibrated for a population in despair. And they responded. In the Reichstag elections of September 1930, the Nazi Party went from 12 seats to 107, becoming the second largest party in Germany. In the presidential election of 1932, Hitler ran against the aging war hero Paul von Hindenburg. He lost, but won over 13 million votes, more than 36% of the total. In the Reichstag elections that followed, the Nazis became the largest party, with 230 seats. They were not a majority, but they were the dominant force in German politics. The path from electoral success to absolute power required one more step, and it was provided by the very establishment that should have stopped him. In January 1933, a group of conservative politicians, led by former Chancellor Franz von Papen, convinced President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. They believed they could control him, use him to destroy the left, and then discard him when he was no longer useful. "We have hired him," Papen reportedly said. "Within 2 months, Hitler shall have been pushed so far into the corner that he will squeak." It was the most catastrophic political miscalculation in modern history. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. The crowds that gathered that night to watch torchlight parades through the streets of Berlin had no idea what was coming. Neither did most of the world. But for those who had read Mein Kampf, for those who had listened to Hitler's speeches, for those who had watched the SA brutalize their opponents, the signs were all there. The monster had been invited into the house. Once in power, Hitler moved with terrifying speed to consolidate his grip on Germany. On February 27, 1933, less than a month after he became Chancellor, the Reichstag building burned. A young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene and confessed to setting the fire. Whether he acted alone or was set up by the Nazis remains debated to this day. What matters is how Hitler used the crisis. Within hours of the fire, Hitler had convinced Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended most civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, privacy of communications, protection against arbitrary arrest, all were swept away in a single stroke. The decree was supposed to be temporary, a response to an emergency. It remained in effect until the end of the Third Reich, 12 years later. In the elections held on March 5, 1933, under conditions of Nazi intimidation and violence, the party won 44% of the vote. It was not a majority, but it was enough. On March 23rd, the Reichstag, meeting in an opera house because its own building had been destroyed, passed the Enabling Act. This law gave Hitler the power to enact legislation without the Reichstag, effectively making him a dictator. The vote was 44 to 94. Only the Social Democrats voted against it. The Communists had already been arrested or had fled. The other parties, including the Catholic Center Party, voted yes, hoping to preserve some role for themselves in the new order. They were wrong. Over the following months, Hitler systematically dismantled every institution that might challenge his power. Political parties were banned or dissolved themselves. Labor unions were abolished and replaced with a Nazi-controlled labor front. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents. The press was brought under Nazi control. The states were subordinated to central authority. By the summer of 1933, Germany was a one-party state, and that party was controlled absolutely by one man. The last potential threat came from within the Nazi movement itself. The SA, now several million strong, was pressing for a second revolution that would sweep away the old elites and redistribute wealth. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, was an old comrade of Hitler's, a fellow veteran of the beer hall putsch. But Röhm's radicalism alarmed the army and the industrialists, whose support Hitler needed. On the night of June 30th, 1934, Hitler struck. The Night of the Long Knives, as it came to be known, was a coordinated massacre. Röhm and dozens of other SA leaders were arrested and shot. So were political rivals like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and conservative critics like Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who had thwarted the beer hall putsch 11 years earlier. The killings were carried out by the SS, a smaller, more elite force led by Heinrich Himmler, which now emerged as the dominant instrument of Nazi terror. The official death toll was 85, but the true number was probably much higher. Hitler justified the purge as necessary to prevent a coup, a claim that was almost certainly false. But the army was satisfied. The threat from the SA had been eliminated, and the SS was clearly subordinate to Hitler personally. When Hindenburg died on August 2, 1934, Hitler combined the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself Führer und Reichskanzler, leader and Reich Chancellor. The army swore a personal oath of loyalty not to the nation or the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. The transformation was complete. The failed artist from Austria was now the absolute ruler of Europe's most powerful nation. To understand what happened next, we must understand the Germany that Hitler inherited. The Weimar Republic had been born in defeat and humiliation. The terms of the Versailles Treaty, signed in 1919, had stripped Germany of territory, limited its military, and imposed crippling reparations payments. The War Guilt Clause forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war, a national humiliation that festered in the German psyche. The republic that rose from the ashes of the Kaiser's empire was never loved by its own people. It was seen as the creation of the victors, a government of traitors who had stabbed the army in the back. The hyperinflation of 1923 had wiped out the savings of the middle class. People who had worked their entire lives found that their life savings would not buy a loaf of bread. Wheelbarrows of currency were needed to purchase basic necessities. The psychological trauma of this economic catastrophe never fully healed. Even after the currency was stabilized, even after the economy recovered in the mid-1920s, the fear of another collapse lingered. When the Great Depression struck, it confirmed every fear, vindicated every suspicion that the system was rotten and needed to be replaced. For many Germans, the early years of the Third Reich seemed like a miracle. The economy recovered with astonishing speed. Unemployment, which had reached catastrophic levels during the Depression, plummeted. By 1936, Germany had essentially achieved full employment. Massive public works projects, the Autobahn highway system being the most famous, put people back to work. Rearmament, in violation of the Versailles Treaty, created jobs in heavy industry. The German people, after years of chaos and humiliation, felt hopeful again. Hitler understood, as few politicians do, the power of spectacle. The Nazi regime was a masterpiece of propaganda and pageantry. The annual party rallies at Nuremberg, designed by Albert Speer and filmed by Leni Riefenstahl, were vast theatrical productions meant to awe and overwhelm. Hundreds of thousands of participants, perfectly synchronized, created images of power and unity that were broadcast around the world. The 1936 Berlin Olympics, carefully managed to present a benign face to international visitors, showcased a modern, efficient, and apparently tolerant Germany. But the new Germany had a darker side, and it was visible from the beginning for anyone willing to look. Within weeks of taking power, the Nazis had established concentration camps to hold their political opponents. Dachau, the first major camp, opened in March 1933. Communists, Social Democrats, trade unionists, and anyone else deemed an enemy of the state were sent there to be re-educated through hard labor and brutal treatment. The camps were not yet the death factories they would become, but they were instruments of terror designed to cow the population into submission. The persecution of Jews began immediately and intensified steadily. On April 1, 1933, the Nazis organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. SA men stood outside Jewish-owned shops, warning customers not to enter. Signs reading Germans, "Defend yourselves, do not buy from Jews," were plastered on windows. It was the first organized act of anti-Semitic violence by the new regime, but it would be far from the last. In September 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of their citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Jews were defined not by their religious practice, but by their ancestry. Anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was classified as a Jew, regardless of whether they or their parents had converted to Christianity. The laws created an elaborate hierarchy of racial categories, turning blood into destiny. Jewish doctors could no longer treat non-Jewish patients. Jewish lawyers could no longer practice. Jewish professors were dismissed from universities. Jewish children were expelled from schools. Jews were banned from parks, from swimming pools, from cinemas. Their businesses were confiscated or forced into liquidation. Every aspect of daily life became a reminder that they were no longer welcome in the country their families had called home for generations. And still, many Jews stayed. They had nowhere to go. Immigration restrictions in other countries limited their options. They could not believe that things would get worse. Some had assimilated so thoroughly that they considered themselves Germans first and Jews second. Others simply could not imagine abandoning their homes, their businesses, their communities. By the time they realized the true nature of the threat, it was often too late to escape. From the beginning, Hitler's foreign policy was aimed at one goal: preparing Germany for war. He needed to rearm, to reclaim lost territories, to build alliances, and to divide his potential enemies. He pursued this goal with a combination of bluff, intimidation, and outright lies, exploiting the war weariness of the Western democracies and their desperate hope that peace could be preserved through negotiation. In 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. In 1935, Hitler announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, a new air force, and the reintroduction of military conscription, both violations of the Versailles Treaty. The Western powers protested, but did nothing. In 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone along the French border. Again, the West did nothing. Each step emboldened Hitler and convinced him that his opponents were weak and would not fight. The Anschluss with Austria in March 1938 was Hitler's first territorial acquisition. German troops marched into Austria, and a Nazi puppet government announced the union of Austria with Germany. Hitler returned to the land of his birth in triumph, greeted by cheering crowds in Vienna. The city that had rejected him as a young man now welcomed him as a conqueror. The world's democracies again did nothing. Next came Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland, the western region of Czechoslovakia, contained a large German-speaking population, and Hitler demanded its annexation. War seemed imminent, but at the Munich conference in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier agreed to Hitler's demands in exchange for his promise that this was his last territorial claim in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London waiving the agreement and declaring that he had achieved peace for our time. Within 6 months, German troops had occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Munich was the final demonstration of the policy known as appeasement. The Western democracies, haunted by the carnage of the First World War, desperate to avoid another conflict, had convinced themselves that Hitler could be satisfied, that his demands were limited and reasonable. They were wrong. Hitler despised them for their weakness. Each concession only increased his contempt and his ambition. In August 1939, Hitler pulled off his greatest diplomatic coup. Germany and the Soviet Union, bitter ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. A secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned between them. The pact stunned the world and cleared the way for Hitler's next move. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. The first 2 years of the war were an almost unbroken string of German victories. Poland fell in less than a month, crushed between German forces from the west and Soviet forces from the east. Denmark and Norway were conquered in April 1940. In May, German armies swept through the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with a speed that astonished the world. The British Expeditionary Force was driven back to Dunkirk and barely escaped annihilation. France, which had expected the war to be fought along the lines of 1914-1918, surrendered in 6 weeks. By the summer of 1940, Hitler was master of Western Europe from the Norwegian Arctic to the Spanish border. Only Britain, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Air Force, remained in the fight. Hitler expected the British to negotiate, to accept the reality of German dominance. They did not. Under Winston Churchill's leadership, they fought on alone, enduring months of bombing during the Blitz, waiting for the tide to turn. Hitler's greatest mistake came on June 22, 1941, when he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by allies from Italy, Romania, Hungary, and Finland, attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Hitler expected the Soviet Union to collapse within weeks, just as France had. The Slavic peoples, he believed, were subhuman, incapable of sustained resistance. He was catastrophically wrong. At first, everything went according to plan. German forces advanced hundreds of miles, encircling entire Soviet armies, taking millions of prisoners. By October, they were within sight of Moscow. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin, whatever his many crimes, rallied his people to a fight for survival. The Russian winter arrived early and brutal. German troops, expecting a quick victory, had not been equipped for cold weather fighting. The offensive ground to a halt in the frozen fields outside Moscow. In December 1941, the war became truly global. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Hitler, in one of his most inexplicable decisions, declared war on the United States. Germany was now at war with the world's 2 largest economies and the world's largest country by territory. The industrial might of America and the endless manpower reserves of the Soviet Union would ultimately prove decisive. But the war would drag on for more than 3 years, and millions more would die before it ended. No account of Adolf Hitler can avoid the Holocaust. It is the central fact of his legacy, the crime that defines him above all others. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, and others deemed undesirable, was not an accident of war. It was the deliberate, carefully planned, industrially executed fulfillment of the ideology Hitler had proclaimed since the 1920s. He told the world what he intended to do. And then he did it. The persecution of Jews had begun the moment Hitler took power, but the actual genocide developed in stages. In the early years of the war, Jews in conquered territories were herded into ghettos, walled-off areas of cities where they were left to starve and die of disease. Mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen followed the German army into the Soviet Union, shooting Jews by the thousands and dumping their bodies in mass graves. At Babi Yar, near Kiev, over 33,000 Jews were shot in just 2 days in September 1941. But shooting was too slow, too public, too psychologically difficult for the killers. A more efficient method was needed. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. The meeting, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, one of the architects of the Holocaust, lasted only about 90 minutes. In that time, the participants discussed the logistics of transporting millions of Jews to extermination camps in occupied Poland, where they would be murdered with poison gas. The death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, were factories of death unlike anything the world had ever seen. Jews were transported in cattle cars from across occupied Europe, packed so tightly they could barely move, with no food, no water, no sanitation. Many died in transit. Those who survived the journey faced a selection on arrival. Those deemed capable of work were spared, temporarily, to be worked to death in slave labor. The rest, the old, the young, the sick, the mothers with children, were sent directly to the gas chambers. At Auschwitz alone, over 1 million people were murdered, the vast majority of them Jews. They were told they were being sent to showers. They were packed into sealed chambers. Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, was dropped through vents in the ceiling. Death came within minutes. The bodies were then burned in crematoria that operated around the clock, their chimneys belching smoke and ash into the Polish sky. The efficiency of the killing was chilling in its bureaucratic precision. Train schedules were coordinated to deliver victims. Camp administrators kept meticulous records. Engineers designed gas chambers to maximize throughput. Chemists calculated the optimal concentration of poison. Doctors conducted selection on the arrival ramps, deciding with a gesture who would live and who would die. The banality of evil, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt would later call it, was nowhere more evident than in the death camps, where mass murder was treated as a logistical problem to be solved with German efficiency. The victims were stripped not only of their lives, but of their identities. Their names were replaced by numbers, tattooed on their arms. Their possessions were confiscated, sorted, and shipped back to Germany. Gold teeth were extracted from corpses. Hair was shaved and used to stuff mattresses. Nothing was wasted. Even the ashes of the dead were used as fertilizer. The Nazis sought to erase their victims from history, to leave no trace of their existence. The scale of the killing is almost impossible to comprehend. 6 million Jews. That is 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were erased from the earth. The Yiddish-speaking world of Eastern Europe, with its rich culture, its literature, its music, its traditions, was annihilated. Children who might have become scientists, artists, teachers, parents, were reduced to ash. The loss is incalculable and permanent. Hitler rarely spoke openly about the extermination. He preferred euphemisms: evacuation, resettlement, special treatment. But there is no doubt that he knew, that he ordered, that he was the driving force behind the genocide. In a speech to the Reichstag in January 1939, he had prophesied that if international finance Jewry should succeed in plunging the nations into another world war, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. It was a threat, and he carried it out. By 1943, the tide of the war had turned irrevocably against Germany. The Sixth Army had been destroyed at Stalingrad, the first major German defeat on the Eastern Front. Allied forces had landed in North Africa and then in Italy. The Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies. American and British bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. The Atlantic Wall that was supposed to make Europe impregnable was breached on D-Day, June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. Hitler, by this point, was a diminished figure. The stress of command, his increasingly erratic lifestyle, and a cocktail of drugs administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had taken a visible toll. His hands trembled. His posture was stooped. He rarely appeared in public. He spent most of his time in the Wolf's Lair, his military headquarters in East Prussia, poring over maps and issuing orders that bore less and less connection to reality. The drugs that Morel administered were extraordinary in their variety and danger. Hitler received daily injections of vitamins, hormones, glucose, and increasingly methamphetamine and opiates. He was addicted, though he refused to acknowledge it. The Führer, who had once railed against the weakness of addiction, was now dependent on a pharmacological cocktail that was destroying his mind and body. His sleep patterns became increasingly irregular. He would stay awake until dawn, hold military conferences in the middle of the night, and then sleep through the morning while his generals waited helplessly for orders. His personal life, always peculiar, became even more so. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, remained devoted, though she was kept hidden from the German public. Hitler seemed incapable of genuine human connection. He was charming when he chose to be, capable of inspiring fanatical loyalty, but ultimately cold and manipulative. The people around him were tools to be used, not individuals to be loved. When they failed him, when they disappointed him, they were discarded without remorse. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German army officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a briefcase bomb in a conference room at the Wolf's Lair. The bomb exploded, killing 4 people, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries. The coup collapsed within hours. Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators were shot or hanged. Hitler's vengeance was terrible. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed, many of them filmed for Hitler's viewing pleasure. The failure of the July plot eliminated the last internal threat to Hitler's rule. As Germany collapsed around him, Hitler retreated into fantasy. He moved units that no longer existed, ordered offensives that could not be carried out, and blamed his generals for failures that were the inevitable result of his own decisions. He refused to allow tactical retreats that might have preserved his armies. He declared that Germany would fight to the last man, that defeat was preferable to surrender. If the war is lost, he told Albert Speer, the nation will also perish. There is no necessity to take into consideration the basis which the people will need to continue even a most primitive existence. In January 1945, with Soviet forces closing in from the east and Allied forces from the west, Hitler moved to the Führer bunker, a concrete fortress beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. It was there that he would spend the last months of his life, 50 feet underground, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, increasingly disconnected from the catastrophe unfolding above. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday in the bunker. Soviet shells were already falling on central Berlin. Most of his remaining followers urged him to flee to Bavaria, where he might organize a last stand in the mountains. He refused. He would stay in Berlin, he said, and die fighting. But there would be no heroic last battle. There would be only a squalid end in a concrete tomb. The final days in the bunker were a grotesque parody of the Nazi court at its height. Hitler still held military conferences, moving imaginary armies across maps while above him, Berlin burned. He raged at the treachery of his generals, at the failure of the German people to be worthy of his genius, at the Jews he still blamed for all his woes. He dictated his last will and testament, repeating the lies and hatreds of a lifetime. On April 28th, Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had attempted to negotiate a surrender to the Western Allies. This was the ultimate betrayal. Himmler, the faithful Heinrich, the architect of the Holocaust, had turned traitor. Hitler ordered his arrest, though there was no one left to carry out the order. He executed Himmler's liaison in the bunker, Hermann Fegelein, who was also the brother-in-law of Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun. On April 29th, just after midnight, Hitler married Eva Braun. She had been his companion for more than a decade, though their relationship had been kept secret from the German public. The ceremony was brief, performed by a city official hastily summoned to the bunker. The witnesses included Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. A small reception followed, with champagne and reminiscences of better days. It was the last party the Third Reich would ever throw. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Hitler ate lunch with his secretaries as usual. He said his final goodbyes. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, he and Eva retired to his private quarters. Those waiting outside heard a single gunshot. When they entered the room, they found Hitler dead, shot through the temple. Eva lay beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning. Their bodies were carried to the garden above, placed in a shell crater, doused with gasoline, and burned. Soviet forces would overrun the chancellery within 48 hours. Adolf Hitler was dead at 56. He had ruled Germany for 12 years, plunged the world into the deadliest conflict in human history, and orchestrated the murder of millions. He left behind a continent in ruins, a nation in shame, and a legacy of horror that would haunt humanity for generations. The 1,000-year Reich he had promised lasted just over a decade. The master race lay defeated and occupied. The Jewish people he had tried to exterminate survived to build a nation of their own. In the end, Hitler's only lasting achievement was destruction. What are we to make of Adolf Hitler? How do we understand a man who caused so much suffering, who embodied evil so completely that his name has become synonymous with the worst of which humanity is capable? These are questions that historians, psychologists, philosophers, and ordinary people have grappled with for 8 decades. There are no easy answers. Some have tried to explain Hitler through psychology, tracing his pathologies to his childhood, to his abusive father, to his smothering mother, to his failures as a young man. There may be some truth in these analyses, but they ultimately fall short. Millions of people had difficult childhoods without becoming mass murderers. Hitler's psychology may have predisposed him to extremism, but it does not explain the ideology he embraced or the crimes he committed. Others have tried to explain him through history, seeing him as the product of specific German traditions: militarism, anti-Semitism, romanticism, the worship of the state. There is more truth here. Hitler did not emerge from a vacuum. The ideas he championed had deep roots in German and European culture. But Germany was not uniquely predisposed to produce a Hitler. Anti-Semitism was rampant across Europe. Authoritarianism was on the rise in many countries. The conditions that allowed Hitler to rise existed elsewhere. What was unique was Hitler himself. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Hitler's life is how ordinary evil can be. The men who carried out the Holocaust were not, for the most part, sadistic monsters. They were bureaucrats, soldiers, engineers, doctors, ordinary people who convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary, or who simply followed orders without questioning their moral implications. Hitler provided the vision and the permission. Others did the work. The German people in their majority were not fanatics. Many supported Hitler because he promised economic recovery and national renewal. Many went along with persecution of Jews because it did not affect them directly, because it was easier to look away than to resist. The few who did resist, the White Rose students, the July 20th conspirators, the anonymous individuals who hid Jews at the risk of their own lives, remind us that courage was possible. But they were the exception. Most people, in Germany and elsewhere, proved capable of accepting monstrous evil when it was presented gradually, when it was wrapped in the flag, when it was easier to comply than to object. This is the true horror of Hitler's legacy. It is not that he was unique, a demon from another realm. It is that he was human, that he drew on impulses and fears that exist in all of us, that he found followers and enablers by the millions. The capacity for the kind of evil Hitler represented is not safely quarantined in the past. It exists in every society, waiting for the right conditions, the right leader, the right moment. The defenses against it, democracy, rule of law, respect for human dignity, are fragile. They require constant vigilance. They can fail. The world that emerged from the Second World War was shaped by the determination to prevent another Hitler, another Holocaust. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the international laws against genocide and crimes against humanity, all were responses to what had happened. Never again became the solemn vow of a generation. But never again has proved harder to keep than anyone hoped. Genocide has happened since, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Darfur. Authoritarian strongmen still rise, still stoke hatred against minorities, still find supporters among the fearful and the resentful. The structures of international law and cooperation that were built to prevent such horrors have proven fragile, dependent on the will of nations to enforce them, vulnerable to the same forces of nationalism and self-interest that enabled Hitler's rise. So what do we learn from the life of Adolf Hitler? We learn that ideas have consequences. The anti-Semitism that was treated as respectable in Vienna in 1910 became the ideology of extermination in Auschwitz in 1943. We learned that democratic institutions are not self-sustaining. The Weimar Republic had a constitution and elections and courts of law, and none of it prevented a determined minority from seizing power and destroying everything. We learned that appeasement of evil only emboldens it. Each concession to Hitler only convinced him that his enemies were weak and that he could demand more. And we learn, perhaps most importantly, that history is not inevitable. Hitler's rise was not predestined. There were moments when he could have been stopped, when different decisions by different people might have changed everything. The conservative politicians who thought they could control him, the Western leaders who thought they could appease him, the ordinary Germans who thought it was not their concern, all made choices. Those choices allowed a failed artist from Austria to become the most destructive figure in modern history. Adolf Hitler died in a bunker, his empire in ruins, his 1,000-year Reich a historical footnote, his master race defeated and occupied. He left behind a world scarred by his crimes, a people shamed by his name, and a legacy that serves as the ultimate warning of where hatred and fanaticism can lead. The world he destroyed took decades to rebuild. The people he murdered cannot be brought back. The trauma he inflicted echoes still in the children and grandchildren of survivors, in the empty chairs at family tables, in the silence where vibrant communities once stood. The photographs of the victims, the names inscribed on memorials, the testimonies recorded before the last witnesses pass away, all remind us of what was lost. And yet, humanity survived. The Jewish people survived. Democracy survived. The values that Hitler despised, freedom, tolerance, the dignity of the individual, proved more resilient than his ideology of hate. They prevailed not because they were inevitable, but because enough people believed in them and were willing to fight for them. That is perhaps the final lesson. Evil is real, and it can prevail for a time. But it is not all-powerful. It can be resisted. It can be defeated. The cost may be terrible, but the alternative is worse. The men who stormed the beaches at Normandy, the civilians who endured the Blitz, the prisoners who maintained their humanity in the death camps, the resistors who risked everything to fight back, They remind us that courage is possible even in the darkest times. We study Hitler not to glorify him, not to understand him in any sympathetic sense, but to arm ourselves against the recurrence of what he represented. The ideology he championed is not dead. The hatred he exploited still exists. The conditions that allowed him to rise, economic despair, political dysfunction, the search for scapegoats, can arise again. They have arisen again. The question is whether we have learned enough from history to recognize the danger and resist it. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in human history. If this video has given you perspective, if it has helped you understand how a civilized nation could descend into barbarism, if it has reminded you why the values of democracy and human rights matter, please share it. Let us continue this conversation. Let us remember, and let us remain vigilant, because the price of freedom, as the old saying goes, is eternal vigilance. The story of Adolf Hitler is not merely a story of one man. It is a story of millions who followed him, enabled him, or stood by while he destroyed everything in his path. It is a story of choices, large and small, that accumulated into catastrophe. It is a story that each generation must learn anew, because the forces that created Hitler, the fear and the anger and the desire for simple answers to complex problems, those forces are always with us. They lurk in every society, waiting for their moment. We live in a time when the lessons of history seem to fade. The last survivors of the Holocaust are passing away, taking with them their irreplaceable testimony. The distance between our time and that terrible era grows with each passing year. For younger generations, the Second World War is ancient history, as remote as the Napoleonic Wars were to those who lived through the 1940s. But the lessons remain urgent. The warning signs are still legible for those who know how to read them. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and never forget.